Here we are. So let me formally welcome all of you. So welcome to the 24th edition of the Education Leadership Forum panel discussion series focused on transforming education for human and planetary flourishing. Thank you for investing your time with us on a weekday. We deeply appreciate your presence and participation. My name is Aryan Salman, and I'm the moderator for this panel discussion. Now, the basis of inclusive education is to ensure that every child has the fundamental right to education and has an opportunity to learn in an inclusive learning environment with pedagogical approaches that ensure that all children are included, engaged, and supported to reach their full potential, and a space that values the unique contributions of all learners from all backgrounds, um, bringing a rich experience within the classroom and allowing learners uh, to grow side by side and benefit themselves and the society at large. But this progress that we look at might come in slowly as we implement inclusive practices that we may not be aware of. So such discussions that we see today are all the more important to accelerate this journey that we are all on to create more and more inclusive learning spaces. Now, as educators, we all know that educators end up as engineers of societal futures, one that they shape through empowering young people to shape their own destinies and destinies of their societies and the world, and help drive meaningful change within the society. So, in this context, we asked today, how can we build bridges to inclusive learning? What are the strategies and best practices for education leaders? Now, as we navigate through this exciting and often not emphasized about topic in many contexts, so we have with us the pleasure of having two stellar panelists, each an expert in their respective fields, and they have a depth of experience in inclusive learning approaches. So I'm delighted to welcome Professor Mirna Nell. Professor Nell is a qualified speech therapist who has worked in support services of the Department of Education for 16 years. In 2006, she was appointed at Northwest University, South Africa, and is currently the Deputy Dean for Research and Innovation in the Faculty of Humanities. Her research interest primarily focuses on teacher education for inclusion and teachers' role in teaching and supporting all learners in an inclusive environment in classroom. It is my great pleasure to welcome Professor Harjeet Kaur Bhatia. Professor Bhatia is the former head of the department and is currently a professor at the Department of Educational Studies at the Jamia Millia Islamia University, a central university in India. She began her journey in the field of education as a school teacher. And since then, she has been persistent and resilient in fostering education that is inclusive. And she has had an inordinate amount of time shaping and transforming young educators. She has been in this professional vocation for almost 3 decades now. So once again, welcome Professor Nell and Professor Bhatia. It's a pleasure to have you both here. For those of you who are new to the Education Leadership Forum, the Education Leadership Forum was started with a mission and mandate to transform education for human and planetary flourishing by providing a platform for education leaders to shape, empower, influence, and advance this discourse around transformative education for human and planetary flourishing. So our goal today is to create a space where experts, practitioners, and education leaders from across the globe can come together and share their knowledge, insights, and best practices for achieving this critical mission. Through the Education Leadership Forum online series, the Global Citizenship Foundation and the Council for Global Citizenship Education are committed to supporting education leaders and educators in their efforts to transform education. We believe that by connecting with one another and sharing our ideas and experiences, we create this positive change in the world and inspire action, and we ensure that all learners gain meaningfully from such discussions and inspiration. So our hope today is that we are able to discuss possible strategies and best practices for education leaders to enhance their teaching and pedagogical approaches and inspire the community to think differently as we co-create the many futures of education. So whether you're an educator, administrator, or policymaker, we believe that you'll come away with something valuable, a new idea, a fresh perspective, a new strategy that you can apply to be more successful at doing what you do best. By investing in your own continuous professional development, you not only help yourself to do your job best, but you're helping ensure that education continues to evolve and improve towards transforming human and planet flourishing. So before we begin this discussion, I would like to remind our attendees that there are different ways of engaging. So you can use the Q&A tab to ask your questions, which is on the right side of this of the platform panel. You can also have an engaged communication with fellow attendees by using the chat section. So without much ado, I would like to yield the floor to Professor Nell. So, Professor, you have uninterrupted 5 minutes to present your case and your perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aryan, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's my first experience with this panel discussion, so very much looking forward to share my ideas. So, Aryan, for me, it is, first of all, as it is a leadership panel discussion, we need to ask what is our responsibility as leaders in an inclusive education system. So there are two aspects here. The first one, do we simply are in education to develop and enhance knowledge and skills, to apply good teaching and assessment methods, to have good pass rates, to complete a prescribed and planned curriculum? Or is our goal also to make sure that we teach the ability to ask questions, think critically, develop a student as a human being, prepare a student to contribute to the world of work, community, and society, and then, of course, to develop a student or a learner to enhance an inclusive and humane society? As we all know, we live in a precarious society. There are so many challenges going on in the world. Well, it's forever, but I think we are very realistic of what's going on these days and things that our learners and teachers need to deal with. So for me, Ariane, it's always about a value, because if we do not value something, we will not attend to it. We will not give action to it. So I, first of all, see inclusion as a value. If we do not enact our good values, then I'm not sure if inclusion will ever work. But then there are two things linked to that for me. It's about a fixed mindset and dealing with an inflexible curriculum. So if we talk about inclusion as a value, for me, it's first of all, being humane, being kind, caring, compassionate, understanding towards other people. I very much like the phrase of Mahatma Gandhi, who said, the greatness of humanity is not in being human, but being humane. And coming from Africa, of course, we have our Ubuntu values, that links to inclusiveness, altruism, kindness, generosity, compassion, respect and concern for others, and of course, treating others with justice, fairness, and human dignity. I'm just wondering every day, if I look at these values, if we actually apply it in our education system. So for me, I define inclusion as treating everyone as of equal value and worth by showing acceptance and respect. And this is most important for me in an inclusive school setting, without stereotyping and labeling someone simply because they come from a different background or look, think, and believe differently. So if we look at inclusion as a value also, for me, it's about a social inclusion approach, which is very much based on human rights and social justice, which also look at contextual influences and we make sure that there are no discriminatory attitudes, that we don't simply separate and exclude people who we think or we consider as different. So, of course, central to this is how do we accommodate diverse learning needs? How do we deal with vulnerability as a result of diversity? There are very, very important issue for me to address when we think about practicalities around making sure that inclusive education works. And that's moving away from a fixed mindset about ability. I don't know, most of you maybe know Carol Dweck, who was seminal in this work around a fixed mindset and working towards a growth mindset. And unfortunately, I see it every day in education, and even in a higher education where I am, that we believe that children are born with a certain ability that will determine their performance levels. And that we don't regard nurturing potential as important. That we need to deal with what we have before us, a curriculum, a prescribed curriculum, and that we must finish that. So we actually do not really work with children, seeing the bigger picture, the holistic picture of children, and that is really quite a concern for me. And linked to that is the whole idea of an inflexible curriculum. In South Africa, one of our key principles of our inclusive education policy is applying a flexible curriculum. But unfortunately, that's not happening, and we need to change that. And if I talk about an inflexible curriculum, we mean that it's dominated by centralized control. So the government, the education department prescribed a curriculum. We need to finish that. It's, we teach to test. It's monitored through standardized and systemic testing. And then we compare results. We look at which schools do well, which schools do bad. And then this actually reflects and teaches that we think that teachers are not good enough to think for themselves and actually teach in a way that all learners deserve to be taught. So it's about a dominant content and results-driven practice. We need to complete this prescribed content within fixed time limits. There's a persistent focus on pass rates and emphasis on high levels of performance. So we actually inhibit quality of learning for all learners. So why don't we nurture students to flourish as enabled human beings, to be meaningful participants in society? All learners, doesn't matter where you come from. Why do we allow so little flexibility in our inclusive education system to accommodate diverse learning needs, by allowing for different paces and levels of learning? Or, not using, so many of my students say that we teach them how to use innovative and variety of teaching strategies. But when they come to a school situation, there is no leeway to use innovative and a variety of teaching strategies, learning activity or assessment methods. Then contextual factors are also not considered. We know that our learners come from different contexts, but that is put aside because we need to finish a curriculum. So just to make a few recommendations that I really think we need to change in our practices to make inclusive education work, and that is integrate a positive education approach, with the emphasis on building inclusive values, resilience, character strengths, and well-being. The saying that you can get all A's and still flunk or fail at life. So implement a flexible curriculum which encourages a growth mindset, accommodate diversity through a variety of teaching, learning, assessment strategies, applying an inclusive pedagogy, but also embed a sensitivity to issues which could result in vulnerability, which usually result from poverty, inequality, attitudes towards different races and genders, language, age, disability, and many other factors. But also integrate an active and critical approach to learning rather than simply rote and uncritical learning of given truths. Jan Hendrik Knoop makes this very important statement. He says that rote learning, just completing a curriculum, making sure that we get our results, that we can show the government or the government can show the media and the people outside there that this education system is successful, that is very negative. And also boring. It's also not effective. So we should make education a positive and inspiring experience by using the differences and diversities in our classroom and emphasize the values of kindness, caring, participation, accommodation. And that is in brief what I want to share with you today. Thank you very much, Arian.
Thank you so much, Professor Nell, for your insights on inclusive education. Professor Bhatia, I yield the floor to you.
Thank you, Aryan, Professor Neil, and audience, and Dr. Aryan. A very good evening to all of you. At the outset, I would like to congratulate Aryan Salman for picking up such beautiful topic, building bridges to inclusive learning, strategies and best practices for educational leaders. I would like to divide this topic into four parts. First is building bridges, which I think is very interesting, and I will deliberate on it. And this is to be done by educational leaders, how they do it. And then I come to inclusive learning, and then I would be focusing on strategies and best practices. I was fascinated when I read Edward Duggar, who is founding partner and president of Reinventure Capital. He says when we have to build bridges, there are three component ingredients, he says. First, he says dignity for all involved. So that means we have to protect and honor human dignity of all involved. Bridges are never built based on pity or obligation. Both sides should be structurally sound. If one side is weak, it is going to fall from there. So, first thing I think is that we have this idea that they are marginalized, they are disabled, they are disadvantaged, or whatever. I think this idea has to go away from our minds. Secondly, there has to be sense of belonging. So we do not go for integration or special education, we make them feel welcome as they are. So this kind of feeling that they are welcomed as they are is very, their whole and authentic self is important to us, is important in building the bridge. Third is there has to be satisfaction from the work done. Everybody has this inclination to grow and improve. So and to contribute to the society around us. So what we have to do is whosoever are the stakeholder, whosoever are the members of the society or of educational institutions, they all should feel that they have sense of accomplishment. Only when we have these three ingredients that all have dignity, sense of belonging, and are satisfied with the work that they do in the organization would be we be able to bridge um, the build the bridges. Secondly, the second thing that you are have conceptualized is that it is to be done by educational leaders, which again I find is very important because I feel leader is one who knows the way, who goes the way, and who shows the way. Usually we find that we feel that leaders are leading the way by showing the way, they do not actually go the way. But when I say educational leader, I would not be only including administrators but also teachers, because they are pedagogues, they are the people in the class, in the institution, who would be leading the this journey of inclusion and inclusive learning. So whenever we have these kinds of leaders, they should be appreciating unique perspectives. That is, they have the mindset of seeing the unique perspective, they recognize the diversity, and they honor the diversity also. And they create a sense of belonging and encourage the environment of collaboration. Everybody should feel supported, not only marginalized, even gifted. Everybody, for that matter, in the class should feel supported. Only then we will have inclusive learning where everyone will have inherent right to be heard, seen, and valued. And as leader, what a person is supposed to do? First, there has to be function of advocacy. That means he or she has to promote inclusive learning in discussions, and in all outreach activities, he has to go to the community and to policymakers, to general public, tell them that this is what is required in every institution. Secondly, awareness raising. He has to spotlight on the needs of the children, not only just by saying, by conducting research, maybe action research, maybe whatever kind of research, because he should be one who looks at the events thoughtfully and observes the happenings in his class. and he or she should be hosting round tables, workshops, and other events for community, for administrators, for government people also. And then capacity building, capacity of education system as a whole, then of teachers, of administrators, of communities, of parents, of caregivers, and technical assistance is also to be provided to the government wherever they need. So he or she herself has to be prepared, and she should be helping in building capacity of the other people. And wherever he or she is doing work, she should always be conducting assessments, monitoring herself and the people involved, so that if there is any gap between what they have planned and what they have been able to achieve, they should be able to do. Now, what is inclusive teaching and learning? I consider it as mindset, where we would be creating opportunities for all learners to connect with the leader and with the course material. As Professor Nail was saying, there has to be modification, content flexibility, reaching out to every learner, and they also connect with each other. Not only course material and teacher, but also collaborate, and peer learning is there. So when we are trying to have this kind of learning, we have to have environment which should be tailored for teachers, leaders who deal with classroom diversity and disadvantaged learners. Actually, we do not have to go by melting pot theory that everybody has to do in the similar manner. We have to be culturally, and we have to have learner responsive pedagogy or techniques, so as to reach out to every learner in the classroom, or in the school, or in the institution, or in the community. For it, we require, first we have to define what we mean by inclusive education. Many people still consider integration as inclusive education, because they feel they are doing favor by including people in this process. But there has to be sensitization. This should be the first strategy and practice, that we sensitize people about what we mean by inclusive education. Now, what should be the process of inclusion? How do we address barriers to the participation? Be it infrastructure, be it curriculum modification, be it accommodation. We have to reach out to every learner. We have to have universal design of learning, maybe through individualized education plans. Whatever strategies we may have, we have to reach out to every learner, not only vulnerable, marginalized, or disadvantaged learners, but also those who are gifted, and they also feel lonely and left out in the class. So we have to reach out to them also. We have to use assistive technology. And when I say assistive technology, I do not mean only digital devices or tools. I also mean services that would be provided by educational leaders, specifically by teachers who are there. So I think Aryan is suggesting me to stop here. Okay, when my turn comes again, I'll again take over. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bhatia, for sharing your thoughts and insights on this one. So, my quick question to both of you. So, I'll begin with Professor Nell. Professor Nell, we talk about having inclusive spaces. I'm assuming that there's a lot more awareness around growth mindset and Carol Dweck's work around the same. But my question to you is like, why do you think that still we face a lot of hurdles and challenges in creating more inclusive classrooms? So if you are to diagnose this whole situation of looking at a classroom, so what do you think are like some of the top challenges that stop either a teacher from implementing it, or from a school from taking proactive action that drives meaningful inclusion?
Ion, complex question. Lots of answers to that, and unfortunately, not always good answers. So from our country's perspective, but I think it could be generalized to many other countries in the world. Of course, we struggle with adequate resources, not enough support. We have schools whose infrastructure is still really poor. And of course, we have lots of rural schools. We have lots of poverty, dealing with that. And of course, with the COVID-19 pandemic, all those kinds of things just highlighted all these problems that we still have. We have classrooms with large number of children in the classrooms coming from lots of diverse backgrounds. And of course, in our country, we have different languages, different religions, different socioeconomic circumstances, which I think is very much the situation in India also. So besides all those things, teachers are overworked. They complain about too much admin, and the key thing for me here is, which has always been my big concern and big critique of why we don't have a full inclusive system, is the whole issue of curriculum pressure. Besides all these real obstacles that we have. But this whole thing of, the government needs to show that they had an 80% pass rate in grade 12, which is our last year, year 12, our last year of school. Without realizing how many children were left behind in that process to get that to their grade 12 results. We still have many learners out of school who cannot cope with finishing curriculum because of lots of circumstances. So this is really my worry, Orion, that we leave so many children behind because teachers are pressurized to complete a curriculum so that they can have good results. So, that can be compared and showed. If we can get away from that, that we really look at what our learners' needs are, that our teachers are able to address different learning needs, address diversity, adapt their teaching and assessment to prepare a learner, not just, to say that listen, I've passed my school career, but that I actually can also cope as a human being, make a contribution, be a successful human being, but also make a contribution to society. Yeah, so of course it's there are much more complexities, but in essence that is something that is really a big concern for me.
Thank you so much, Professor Nell. Professor Bhatia, you've been working with educators um, from the Indian context, uh, and I'm assuming that, many countries would have similar challenges that Indian educators face. So, according to you, what do you think are three key challenges in the space of, say, teacher education, primarily, that you think we need to focus on to ensure that we are able to prepare our teachers to build these bridges within their classrooms? So, what do you think are the three challenges that you think we need across systems, to think about as we address this topic?
Yes, so it is very difficult to cull out three challenges, but I'll try. First thing, I think the mindset. Mere having this kind of mindset that we are not inflicting any harm over vulnerable people, and teacher doesn't want to take into account what are the specific needs of the learners. I think this is the biggest challenge. Unless we are aware that we are doing something wrong, how would we improve upon it? So the first thing is there is no sensitization of the people and the kind of processes they are involving in without paying attention to the needs of specific learners or recognizing diversity, or when they try to make everybody look alike. This is the biggest challenge. Second challenge, what I find, is related to infrastructure. So, though there would be certain people who would like to have inclusive learning for their learners, for the whole group of learners, but they do not have sufficient resources. I think the government has to come forward and has to provide infrastructural facilities. Not only infrastructure in terms of material things, we do not even have sufficient teachers. So this kind of paucity, that we do not have infrastructure, no ramps, no disabled friendly things, no policies or certain things that should be in favor of learners, they should be essentially be provided to learners, is not there. At least in India, I can say that. Thirdly, I feel the teacher education curriculum. Though there has been RPDW Act, RPWD Act 2016 in place, but many teacher education institutions do not offer this kind of curriculum to the learners. So the pre-service teachers are not prepared actually to take over um, the challenges in the class where they have to teach. The right to education says that every learner is to be admitted into the class, but teacher education curriculum does not prepare pre-service teachers to be adequately equipped to deal with all kinds of learners and to honor diversity of the learners. I think this is very important and this needs to be taken care of. So these would be three challenges from my side.
Aryan, will you allow me to add something to that? Prof.
Sure,
Bhatia
Professor. Please
mentioned
go.
so much important things. We were involved in a project trying the Department of Higher Education Training, brought together all the universities in South Africa, specifically who had teacher education, trying to see how we can prepare our teachers for inclusive education. And that has happened quite a few years, and we had research projects around that. And I think because the attitude still persists and or the value still persists, that inclusive and I found it very irritating if we talk about inclusive and special education, because it's inclusive education, but that attitude still persists, that inclusive or special education is still someone else's responsibility. It's not every teacher's responsibility. And we struggle with that. We have tried in this project to still have our modules on inclusive education, but to infuse, how exactly as Prof. Bhatia also said, preparing every student to deal with diversity and inclusion in the classroom. But unfortunately, it's still about, the science teacher or the, geography teacher says, no, that's not my responsibility. That person who has been appointed to deal with inclusion or special education. And I think that is also one of our biggest challenges. Thank you for allowing me to add that.
Thank you, Professor Nell and Professor Bhatia. It was quite insightful. One of the things that from Professor Bhatia's discussion that I took away was it's not just physical infrastructure that we're talking about. We're also looking at non-physical infra. That just reminded me of this discussion that I had with one of a group of professors in the past. So we have uh, a lot of care that we take for pilots who fly us from one place to another. We take a lot of care in ensuring that, medical professionals are not stressed or their mental well-being is taken care of as much as possible. However, that is not the case when you look at educators. So when Professor Bhatia was talking about how there's a lot of workload, and Professor Nell, you also highlighted the idea that educators are burdened with a lot of administrative tasks. So the idea that if you're trying to shape the future and you're stressed, so how do you expect somebody so stressed to create a beautiful painting? When you're stressed, your hands are shaking. So I think that's one thing that I was able to drive from that discussion. And then, Professor Nell, from your discussion, I was able to draw that, the moment you look at inclusive education as an add-on, that is where the problem begins. So I think these were interesting ideas. And I think whether it's Carol Dweck's work or even looking at, what do you call, there's this famous TED talk. I'm not getting the name of the person, but I think it's to do with connecting with children. So I think I can share this at the end of it. So if you don't connect with your students, no learning can happen meaningfully. I think that's one thing that I could also see as a resonation from the discussion that we have had so far. Now, my next question to you folks, I mean, so like, I would begin with Professor Nell again. Professor Nell, when you look at say teacher engagement, what are some of the things that you see teachers are doing in your context that you think every teacher should be doing? So if there's anything that you think you'd like to share with us, that would be great. I know I've asked you impromptu, but I think it would be great if you can just take a moment and share with us if possible, or even
Oh,
from your own context that you do that. It's essential.
Oh, Arjan, so I of course, I mean, we've mentioned it, both myself and Prof. Bhatia. It is about a mindset first. Uh, Believing, there's a phrase that believing that all children can achieve. Um, yes, Arjan. So it begins with a mindset, and then being allowed, or taking the courage to actually say, but I want to teach differently to what I am told how to teach. So if a school inspector, or in our situation with district officers, come and say, but listen, you need to do this. This is the template that you need to use. This is the lesson plan that you need to use. But to actually take the courage and say, but you are not, you don't know what the needs of my children in my classrooms are. You don't know what the context of the children in my classroom are. So for me, I would really say, and then caring. Much has been written. I'm sure many people know about Nell Nodding's wonderful publications about the ethics of care. So yes, I think those are the three starting points: taking courage, really caring, but changing a mindset to think that I for me, it's not just about transferring knowledge so that someone can pass school, get a degree or a diploma, and become a good worker, but that it's much more than actually that it's actually about growing a human being. Um, yeah, and of course, I mean, then it's definitely about having the skills to teach and having the skills to assess, so that we can accommodate diverse learnings. That is the practicality. We need to teach that. And I don't know if you also know about the whole idea of inclusive pedagogy, that we teach in such a way that we don't need in the end to provide additional support, that we teach flexible, that we teach in different ways, that we think on our feet while we teach, to make sure that we know our learners. And that's maybe the one thing that is also important. We need to know our learners. Now, I know our teachers will immediately say, listen, I've got 40, 50 children in my classroom. It's very difficult to know each learner, but we need to make that trouble as fast as possible to do that. Yes, so I can go on about this, Arjan, but let me stop there.
Thanks, Professor Nell. Professor Bhatia, in your context, I mean, so like, what are some of the strategies that have worked for you while you're dealing with young teachers, trainee teachers that you work with? So, what are the things that you think can be replicated from your context, even with kids? So,
So I think first thing that we try to focus on is that we try to understand the context of the learners, and we try to reduce barriers to learning by every learner, barriers to learning for every learner, and we try to enhance the participation for all students, not only those who have impairments or who have been categorized as having special educational needs. I feel that every child is to be considered as a resource in our pre-service teacher education courses also. And when we send our students to the schools, we try to make them understand that diversity is to be valued. Every student should be considered as a resource. I give you an example. For example, there might be a blind child in my class, And certain people or certain teachers have this kind of feeling that he or she is good for nothing, and they do not try to involve that child in the class at all. So, what they can do, if that child is good at singing or narrating stories or folklores, and he can be utilized as a resource in the class where he sings some poem or he tries to narrate a story related to context. I would also like to cite here one example. I was visiting one of the teacher education institution in a tribal area, and a team of experts went from Delhi, and they said the people in this area are good for nothing. They do not know English. They are good for nothing. They don't know anything. And one of the team members was bitten by a mosquito and whatever, some insect, and that person became unconscious. The people whom we were saying that they are good for nothing, he knew what leaf to take and how to utilize it so that he could be revived. So the knowledge that comes in their place is important in their context if they know that, and if they have the sense of accomplishment that I can lead a productive life. That thing, the instilling that in our pre-service teachers, and through them trying to percolate it down to our school students, that is what I think we do. And we have so many success stories related to it. Our students have so many success stories related to it, and really feel so good about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bhatia, for sharing your thoughts on the same. Now, um, technology, as you know, plays a significant role, and I think during COVID it has uh, played a pivotal role in many contexts. So whether it was using WhatsApp to teach, which in certain contexts was also um, a space where teachers were having a very difficult time connecting with parents, as I personally heard from quite a few educators that parents would literally end up harassing on WhatsApp. So we've had a lot of issues with technology even during COVID, where teachers had to face a lot of challenges, and yet they were able to navigate with those technologies. Now, coming to the context, like it's both from technology from the perspective of a teacher, as well as technology from perspective of inclusive learning spaces. So how do you see this adoption, and where do you want to see technology to be in this whole what do you call focus on creating inclusive learning environment? So what is the role according to you of technology? Is it like the linchpin, or is there something that we need to be cautious or mindful? So this is a question to both of you. Either of you can take this one, and then we'll move on to the next phase where you'll ask questions to each other. So um, yes.
Okay, okay. Aryan, I would like to suggest here that assistive technology has come something which will be used by everyone in inclusive learning. So we cannot do away with technology, more so when our learners are digital natives. They use it quite seamlessly. So the teachers have to be prepared to utilize technology to reach out to them. I think it is very important, though technology will not replace teachers, definitely, but it will definitely replace those who can use, who cannot utilize technology with those who can use it actually. So assistive technology, that is using tools and services, would be essential in our inclusive learning spaces. We would be requiring low tech, mid-tech or high-tech aids to help our learners to achieve their goals. For example, even utilizing a lens would be required, or we may have softwares like JAWS or various other things. There are so many softwares which are there for learning specific learning needs. So, and this technology is also going to help us in modification, curriculum modification, and curriculum accommodation, because it will help us to have worksheets or various other teaching learning materials which will be specifically designed for each of our learners, taking into account their learning needs, their learning styles, and whatever their needs and what they deserve. So I think technology would be here, and we have to embrace it, and we should be competent enough, and we build the capacity of our future teachers and in service teachers to utilize it in the manner that every learner is able to do their best. Empower every learner. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bhatia, for the same. So now I request Professor Nell to ask any questions that you have to Professor Bhatia.
I don't, may I quickly say something about technology? Of course, there are fantastic opportunities that technology provide us, but the one thing that COVID-19 taught us is that still lots of children are being excluded because they don't have proper access to technology. And the sad result of this was with the many months where children couldn't go to school and where they had to rely on technology, and where they didn't have access, that a lot of our children are now behind. And what I see happening, which is really a concern, is that many of these children are placed in special schools or special classes now. They are seen as slow learners, because they remain behind. So yes, that is the one scary thing about technology, that we still have too many children who's excluded from technology. And I know that there's this whole debate about ChatGPT and how that is used. The one thing, there are great things that we can use it for. The one thing that scares me a little is that it takes away the possibility of people to be creative. I attended a conference a few weeks ago where a principal of a special school said, that they use it to write songs and write stories. And that scares me a little, because that takes away for us the opportunity to develop creative and critical thinking. So yes, so maybe that is my question to Prof. Bhatia also. By all means, using assistive devices, we need to use that. Lots of opportunities that technology provides us to include more and more people. But it's also excluding more and more children. So yes, maybe that is my question to Prof. Bhatia around the situation, or what her ideas around that is.
So, I feel that if we know how to use technology well, I feel that we can use it for inclusion more than exclusion, because now with technology becoming quite cheap and quite available to the learners, earlier things were quite costly. Now technology has become quite cost effective. I won't say cheap, but cost effective, and many people are utilizing technology in their lives. So maybe the infrastructure we have at institutions may not be that upgraded, but with BYOD, that is bring your own device, and learners have it with them. And the state, I think, should have this responsibility. We cannot absolve state of providing those who need help. They can't absolve themselves of this responsibility. We have to make them provide the stakeholders with whatever technology they require, and we have to prepare or build the capacity of the teachers in assisting the learners to use the technology effectively so that they are empowered. The main goal is to be empowering the learners, and I think technology has a role to play for inclusion and not for divide. I hope I have answered your question. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Bhatia. Now you may please
Okay.
feel free to ask a question to
Okay.
Professor Nell.
Professor Neil has very beautiful remarks and very beautiful anecdotes related to inclusion in her country. I would like to know whether you have any index for inclusion in your country, or how do you assess the schools, whether they are providing inclusive learning to the learners or not, or isn't it, it isn't done at all.
Bhatia. So yes, so we don't have so we have an inclusive education policy, and which was introduced in 2001, many years ago. And of course, now we're asking still many questions so many years later why it's not implemented as it should be. And from that, we operational policies was developed to try and transform schools into inclusive schools, specifically around the support of learners. Of course, we are quite aware of the index of inclusion. We were all trained in the index of inclusion. And in some instances, it was adapted for the South African institution, for the South African education system, and in some schools. Um, the Department of Higher Education and Training has also started developing what they call standards, you know, as a requirement for developing teachers into inclusive teachers. So there are many documents, there are many policies, there are many operational guidelines that are in place, which are beautiful. I always say, that South Africa is a very good example in developing documents and policies and guidelines. But when it comes to the implementation, there are all, lots of concerns. And again, I come back to, I think one of the causes here, if we look at our education department, our district offices, there's the inclusive education department, and then there's the curriculum department and all the other departments which do not really link with each other. So we can have all these wonderful inclusive documents in place, but if everyone in education, from parents to teachers to education officials, do not talk to each other, and teacher education institutions also, and that has always been a problem. We try with many conversations, symposiums, and conferences to bring people from all spheres in education together to have these conversations. And I feel every year we have these conversations, we start the conversations from the beginning, because there's still a lot of misconception and misunderstanding. And all these different spheres do not talk to each other to bring everyone's experience and knowledge together. So yes, we have those things in place, but bringing it together and making it work, unfortunately, still a challenge.
Thank you,
I
Professor
think,
Nell. Yes, Professor.
Dr. Salman, I think you can allow me to add to her. The issues that you have listed are quite applicable in India also. Uh, the policy is not implemented in letter and spirit. We also have very good documents, and the data and the efforts do not match between various organizations. I think even the need assessment is not done properly in our country. How to prepare people so that they can tackle. And one major issue that I find is mindset, considering those people as someone who need our pity, or I think this kind of mindset has actually hampered in having inclusive education, though we call about quality education, but it is not quality education. It is not right for everybody. In our country, I consider it as a privilege which is given to elite. Quality education, so inclusive education no doubt is quality education.
That was a beautiful quote, Professor Bhatia. Inclusive education is itself quality education. So, thank you for sharing that one. I think we'll take a few audience questions. But before that, I just wanted to share with both of you, as a first generation learner myself, one of the stark contrasts that I could see between two teachers. Like I had one of the teachers who would have this attitude uh, that I, as an individual, am a speck of dust, would not matter in the large scheme of things. And I had another amazing educator who'd end up saying, "How would you even know if you have not tried it? Why don't you try it?" And even if I did not so good, it'd be like, at least you did that well. And I think that that would remind me of, like, that TED talk that I was talking to you about by Rita Pearson, on every child needs a champion. So I think the idea of and many years later, when I asked the same educator, why would you do what you did, uh, the person ended up telling me that, like, hey, it was because my favorite teacher would do that to me, and I had a teacher that I did not like. So I think we have similar situations. Even as educators, we have enjoyed company of a few teachers, and we might not have enjoyed company of a few others. So the question for all of us as educators is, are we moving in the direction of the teachers we did not like? Or are we reflecting on a daily basis and trying to be better than our most favorite teacher? So that's a question for all the audience. Now let's take the audience question. So here's the first question. I think this is by Rusu Elena, who is vice principal at LCI. So just give me a second. So the question that they ask is, what focus or objectives must set the teacher while having in class both special education needs and gifted children? How better to plan the lesson and priorities? Yes, who would like to respond to this one?
Could you please flash the question again on the screen so that we answer every part of it? So when you say what focus or objectives must set the teacher while having in the class both SEN and gifted children, I think she has to include every learner. Every child is important. I think the focus or objective is not only related to content but also to meeting the learning needs of every child. So if she has both special education need children and gifted children, she has to plan taking into account universal design of learning, reaching out to both. She has to honor diversity. She has to utilize a student as resource. She can make gifted learner do certain things for SEN and SEN do certain things for gifted learner, because both of them would have certain strengths and certain weaknesses. She has to identify, and strength of a person and weakness of the other person has to be matched so that the both of them should benefit. SEN should never feel that he is less than gifted child. I think both of them should have win-win situation where they like to interact with each other, where they like to complement each other, and where they like to be together, collaborate with each other so that they both productively do certain things. Thank you.
Yes, Ariane, having we very much tend to put learners and cohorts together. So we will put the slower learners, the same learners together, and then the average learners, and then the gifted learners, or the more clever learners, if we can label them like that. Um, because that's the easiest way to teach learners, because then we can do the same thing for every learner. Which is not the right way to do it. So using, group activities, peer learning, where you can actually put the different levels of learning together in one group and use strategies to learn from each other. Exactly as Prof. Bart just said, learning from strengths and weaknesses. Not easy. I know it's not easy, especially if you have a class with lots of learners. Not easy. But we must be very careful to put learners into how we think, what we think the learner's ability is, and put them in a group together. Ariane, how easily, if you have behavior problems, how easily you are put into, the E class. And if you're this perfect learner, you're put in the A class. But when it comes to the, ability, the learner with a behavior problem most probably have more ability or intellectual ability than the learner in the A class. So those kinds of things is really important to consider.
Thank you, Professor Bhatia and Professor Nell. I think one of the things that you mentioned about how it's important to focus on the experience. Um, so while you were talking about it, one of the things that I remembered was Dr. Alok Bajpai, who's a renowned psychologist in India. So he works with the IIT. And like in the recent discussion that we had on one of the Education Leadership Forum discussions, he spoke about the role of trauma, like how trauma is such a memorable incidence in many of our lives, and how important it is to have the kind of experiences. So if you tell the child something like equality, diversity, without making them experience that, without making them feel included, you cannot expect an inclusive child. So I think that was one thing that it came to my mind. And the question around gifted, I think I had a couple of cents around that. So one of the things that I was thinking is to treat every child as gifted in a way that each one is gifted in their own ways. And the second thing is to treat every gifted child as normal as you can, because I think that's the beauty that I was thinking about. I mean, so like, and then perhaps how many of us, like, this is also a question of creating that inclusive space. Diversity, yes, we get it naturally because, like, you have admissions from different spaces. We might put some effort, but what is our ultimate contribution around diversity? How are we using it? So one of the things that when I was teaching in school, what I would look at was um, one of the things that I was looking at was, like, the check-in experience. So would ask the kid, what is your favorite thing? Or how do you like to do this? Or what do you enjoy the most about a certain thing? So instead of taking present and absent during attendance, perhaps that could be something that we could also look at, right? So these are some of the things that I was able to reflect on while you folks were talking about. And
Aryan, I
uh,
think we can tell our students to look
uh-huh,
some qualities in others and then discuss it with the class. Maybe
uh-huh.
they would be able to look at those qualities which we are not, and then we would be able to utilize those qualities when we design our learning experiences in inclusive learning settings.
Mhm.
Arjan, yeah, so I heard, I hope I didn't hear it as I did, that you talked about the inclusive child. This is something that we do as human beings. We label and we stereotype. So this happens in South Africa because with our inclusive education policy, we actually decided to move away from the term special educational needs. Because we just, every child is special because it's used as a label. And then we moved to the term addressing barriers to learning, and then that got abbreviated. Then it was, the uh, abled kind of label. And then, I started hearing that people are talking about the inclusive child. Now, sorry, but that really upsets me because every child should be included. So, being the inclusive, so if you're now in special class or special education, you're an inclusive child. And it comes back to the whole issue of integration, where we integrate a child with special educational needs in a classroom, but it's still that child that needs to adapt to the classroom, to the system. And inclusion doesn't work like that. It's how the system and we make provision accommodate that learner. And you also talk about, normal. I always ask my students the question, what do you see as normal? Because how I see normal and how someone else sees normal can be quite different. So yeah, just maybe, to be careful to use the word normal. Um, so that's just my 2 cents about that. Aryan, you are muted.
You muted, Aaron. Yes.
Okay, happens at times. So, thank you so much, Professor Nell, for highlighting that. I think a lot of times we end up using terms, going about things that are primarily stereotypical in the way we go about it. And I think there's a need for us to reflect as we move forward and consciously have an inclusive language, perhaps a guide that guides you into using inclusive vocabulary within the classroom environment. So thank you so much for highlighting that. And I think over the past few years, one of the things that we at the foundation have been working on is to create this inclusive guide where you're avoiding ableist language, where you're avoiding racist language, where you're avoiding non-inclusive languages that end up limiting somebody's potential as an individual. So thank you so much for highlighting that, Professor Nell. Now we are moving towards the end of the discussion for today. I just want to quickly, have maybe a minute of your thoughts on what is that one thing that educators should start, stop, and continue to ensure that they are able to build bridges and identify newer strategies to make them more to make their classrooms more inclusive, assuming that no one strategy fits all. So how do what are the things that they can start, stop, and continue to either discover new stuff or to be more what do you call adaptable to inclusive practices? So we can have that. I know one is a little hard.
That's putting us on the spot here, Aryan. It's difficult. So what I always tell my students, of course, starting is definitely with a mindset, thinking on your feet, um, seeing inclusion as a value. I think that would be my starting, having a mindset of seeing inclusion as a value. And stop, as soon as you start using exclusive language or exclusive practices, to be aware, and to stop and say, listen, no, I am, the way that I'm teaching here, the way that I'm assessing here, is not right. I think that is always, we are so many times just going with the flow, so we get the recipe from the department, we get the recipe from our teacher education, and that makes us feel safe. We need to follow that recipe. But if we don't stop, if we see this recipe is not working, that we need to try different things, that is important. And of course, then we need to be lifelong learners. We always need to continue to develop and learn about new things and how to do new things, and not get stuck in this mindset of, I need to follow a recipe, that's what I have, that's what I can deal with. But always be willing to learn, and listen, being part of these kinds of discussions, to open perspective, to open mind. So maybe in brief, that's what I would say. Yes.
Yes, what I feel is, as educators, we have to be sensitive, humane, and reflective to the context. I think both psychological and sociological perspective of learners are to be taken into account, and we have to have an approach to empower every learner in our class. As Professor Nell said, we have to be open, flexible if something doesn't work. We don't go only by prescriptive treatments. Maybe what hasn't worked, we look for what will work, change again, try again. The intention of empowering every learner would definitely help us as teachers, and we would be able to win this better. I think so. You are muted, Salman.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Nell and Bhatia, Professor Bhatia. So it was a pleasure to hear both of you. conversations such as these foster us in the direction that we would like to be in. So I would be formally concluding the event. But before I do that, I just wanted to inform our audiences that tomorrow we would have Dr. Janet Berman. She is a principal fellow at University of Melbourne. She would be delivering a distinguished global lecture tomorrow on strategies and best practices around inclusive learning. So we'll be very happy to see you tomorrow around the same time for the distinguished lecture. So let me take this moment to express my deepest gratitude to our panelists today for having for having driven this discussion in a direction that accelerates us towards an inclusive environment as we uh, attempt shaping the same in our own context. So I believe that creating an educational environment that is intentional, inclusive, empathetic, compassionate, and mindful is crucial, not just for the growth, development, and success of all learners, but that of also all educators. So it is our responsibility as educators, as education leaders in this arena, to shape policies and practices that foster such an ecosystem within our abilities. So with educators, school leaders, and students all working together, we believe that the power and potential to effect positive transformation in the field of education is possible. So I understand that we may have many questions that we have not been able to cover or answer them sufficiently through this discussion. So your thoughts, ideas, suggestions, and feedback are valuable to us. So please don't hesitate to share them by emailing us or tagging us on the social media posts. So we really appreciate your recommendations on the topics that you'd like to see discussed in the future events. We'd be very delighted to hear from you. Also, do not forget to join in the global networking at the lounge uh, and participate in the speed networking. So on behalf of the Global Citizenship Foundation, the Council for Global Citizenship Education, and all our attendees, I extend my deepest gratitude to both our panelists for taking out the time out of their busy schedules and enriching this discourse through their unique ideas, insights, and experiences. I'm also very grateful to them for having been with us even when we're facing technical difficulties. So also thank you for being part of the Educational Leadership Forum and for being here with us as active participants in this discussion, and for everything that you do to advance this discourse on transforming education for human and planetary flourishing within your local context as well as forums such as these. So we really appreciate your time, insights, and efforts that you have taken to contribute to driving this extremely crucial discussion towards shaping the many futures of education for generations of young people. So please proceed to the lounge event to expand your reach and network. See you soon. Until then, take care, stay safe, and spread love and compassion. Our world needs it more. And as educators, I think we can give a lot more. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor, am I audible?